Okay, let's unpack this. 27 Indian civilians dead in a horrific terror attack in Pahalgam, Jammu, and Kashmir on April 22nd, 2025. It's easy to see that it's just one terrible event.
It is a terrible tragedy.
But what if it's not? What if this event isn't, a piece in a much bigger puzzle, a geopolitical one? That's sort of the territory we're exploring in this deep dive.
Precisely. We're not looking at it in isolation. The materials we've dug into, they present a pretty compelling argument that this could be part of a deliberate, modern, great game.
A great game.
Yeah.
Aimed at hindering the rise of Asian powers.
That's the core idea, yeah, to slow down their ascent.
Right. So the analysis we're looking at suggests that the West, and particularly the U.S., sees the growing economic clout of Asia. Think China, India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. Sees that as a fundamental challenge to its established global leadership.
Exactly. And the Pahalgam attack, viewed through this lens, isn't just terrorism, it's potentially a tool.
A tool to create instability.
That's the central thesis we're working with from these sources. We're seeing this massive power shift, this eastward movement of economic weight.
Yeah, you can feel it.
And the argument presented is that the West sees this as a critical challenge and is actively looking for ways to slow it down, maybe even roll it back.
So this new great game, for listeners who might not know the original, can you give us the quick historical context?
Sure. The original great game, that was the 19th century rivalry, Britain versus Russia, fighting for influence over Central Asia. Very much about territory and imperial control.
Okay. But this new one.
This modern version, as laid out in our sources, it's different. It's less about grabbing land and more about leadership in manufacturing, global trade, technology.
The foundations of the modern economy.
Exactly.
Oh.
And controlling the key economic arteries, the trade routes, the supply chains.
So it's about the infrastructure of global power. And the central idea is that the U.S.-led West feels threatened by Asia's economic engine.
That's the core argument presented. And the Pahalgam attack within this framework, it becomes something more than just local terror.
How so? What's the connection?
Well, the hypothesis put forward is that it's designed to spark wider regional instability, specifically to draw India into a conflict with Pakistan.
Right, two nuclear powers.
Precisely. And also potentially to disrupt China's huge investments in CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
Which runs right through that region.
It does. And more broadly, just to create this climate of fear and uncertainty that could slow down Asia's economic momentum.
Okay, that's a provocative idea. The notion that a turbulent South Asia could actually be seen as beneficial to the West.
Yeah.
How does that logic work, according to the sources?
The reasoning laid out is, pretty strategic, if cynical. Regional turmoil could make global investors nervous about putting money into Asian markets.
Oh, they pull back.
They might pull back, yeah. Or redirect investment towards the perceived safety of Western markets. It could stall the shift of manufacturing eastward.
Which has been a huge trend.
A massive trend. And it could disrupt these really complex global supply chains that Asia is now central to.
So it's fundamentally about preserving economic advantage. And the sources really emphasize Asia's manufacturing boom as the core of this challenge.
Absolutely. Manufacturing capacity is framed as the bedrock of real global power. And Asia is, it's clearly re-emerging as the world's factory floor.
Let's break that down. China, obviously, is the giant in the room.
Undeniably. The analysis points out China accounts for, over 28% of global manufacturing output?
28%, that's huge.
It's more than the U.S., Germany, and Japan combined. And it's not just cheap goods anymore. They're moving fast into really critical future industries, EVs, green energy, AI, robotics.
And that Made in China 2025 plan is part of that.
Exactly. The sources cite that as a clear statement of national ambition, aiming for dominance in these high-tech industrial sectors.
But it's not just China, right? Japan's still a major force.
Oh, absolutely. Japan is described as a continuing tech and industrial superpower. And crucially, it controls key choke points in global supply chains.
Choke points? Like what?
Think advanced materials, processing rare earth elements which are vital for electronics, high-precision robotics, and really critical semiconductor manufacturing machinery, like ASML's lithography machines, essential for advanced chips. Japan plays a huge role there.
Okay, and South Korea.
Also a powerhouse. Big strengths in semiconductors, obviously, but also shipbuilding, high-end electronics, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, major global players mentioned in the sources.
Then there's Vietnam. Kind of the quiet achiever.
Exactly. It's portrayed as this rapidly emerging hub, especially for electronics, clothing, light machinery, partly benefiting from companies doing the China plus one thing.
Right, diversifying away from just China, hedging their bets.
Precisely, spreading the risk, building alternative supply chains.
And where does India fit into this manufacturing picture?
India is described as being on the cusp of a major industrial comeback, driven by things like the Make in India initiative, these PLI schemes.
Production-linked incentives.
Right, and there's a growing push for new semiconductor hubs and defense manufacturing corridors, too.
So if you add all that up, China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, India, this whole Asian manufacturing arc, what's the core threat perceived by the West, according to these materials?
The main concern highlighted is that this combined manufacturing could lead to a more self-sufficient Asian economic sphere.
An independent bloc.
Potentially. One capable of setting its own global standards, maybe developing its own leading technologies, perhaps even challenging the dominance of the U.S. dollar with alternative currencies or payment systems.
Okay, so that's the perceived threat. The West sees this happening. What do the sources say they're doing about it? It sounds like it's moved past just, competing fairly.
Yeah, the argument presented is that when normal economic competition didn't seem to be enough, the West, primarily led by the U.S., shifted towards more coercive tactics.
Coercive, okay.
And economic warfare is described as the first phase of that.
Right. Which brings us to tariffs.
Tariffs made a big comeback, didn't they? Highlighted as a major tool under President Trump. Slapped not just on China, but also Europe, Japan, even allies like South Korea and Vietnam.
Under the banner of fair trade.
Right. But the effect, intended or not, is disrupting supply chains, raising costs, making it less appealing to manufacture in those targeted countries.
And the 2025 trade war with China is presented as a key example of this escalation.
A really significant escalation, according to the analysis. We're talking massive tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods, plus this big push for companies to move supply chains out of China, reshoring back home or friendshoring to allied countries.
And the goal there?
The stated intent, as interpreted by these sources, is to directly break China's manufacturing lead and weaken its push for industrial leadership in key areas.
Are tariffs the only economic weapon mentioned?
No, export controls are another big one, specifically targeting critical tech semiconductors, AI, biotech.
Like the restrictions on Huawei.
That's cited as a prime example, limiting their access to essential chips and software to basically cripple their competitiveness on the global stage.
And this pressure isn't just on China, you said.
No, the sources point to subtler pressures, too. Renegotiating trade deals with Japan and South Korea, using export controls strategically, especially around semiconductors, even hitting Vietnam with tariffs despite being seen as a partner because of its trade surplus with the U.S.
But the strategy isn't purely economic, is it? This idea of manufacturing regional crises sounds much more kinetic.
It does. It's a serious allegation. The argument is there's a deliberate Western effort to stir up or worsen existing conflicts.
Like Taiwan.
Taiwan, Kashmir, the South China Sea disputes, tensions on the Korean Peninsula, reigniting these frozen or simmering conflicts.
Why? What's the strategic goal of doing that?
The logic presented is that these conflicts act as a massive drain. They divert national resources away from economic development towards defense spending.
Right. Money spent on tanks isn't spent on factories.
Exactly. It creates uncertainty, scares off foreign investors, and generally slows down the whole process of industrial transformation. And South Asia, with the India-Pakistan tension, is seen as a prime target for this kind of strategy.
Which brings us back to Pahalgam.
Directly. The attack is linked in this analysis to that strategy of manufactured chaos, designed to provoke India, trigger an escalation with Pakistan, and maybe even pull China deeper into the mess because of its CPEC interests.
This is where it gets even darker. The sources talk about the deep state and the use of proxy groups. Feels like we're shifting into covert operations territory. And just to clarify, by deep state, the sources mean these networks of unelected officials who might influence policy covertly.
Indeed. The analysis actually draws a line from past covert ops, especially those reported along the Iran-Pakistan border, suggesting that playbook is now being used more widely.
The example given involving Mossad and Jondallah is, well, it's pretty explosive.
It is. The materials detail claims that back in the mid-2000s, Israeli Mossad agents, allegedly posing as CIA, recruited militants from Jondallah, that's a Sunni extremist group in Pakistan's Balochistan province,
Okay.
recruited them to carry out terror attacks inside Iran. The supposed goal was to destabilize Iran without Israel's direct fingerprints being on it.
And this apparently came out later.
It was reported later, yes, around 2012, and supposedly caused quite a shock among some U.S. officials who were unaware.
And Balochistan itself is positioned as strategically key for these kinds of ops.
Yes, it's described in the sources almost as a springboard for chaos, first against Iran. And the argument now is that this same model is being used to sabotage China's Belt and Road Initiative.
How so?
By supporting, or at least enabling, Baloch insurgent groups like the BLA, the Balochistan Liberation Army, their attacks on Chinese projects and personnel, especially around the Gwadar port.
Which is the linchpin of CPEC.
Exactly. The attacks have become more sophisticated, suggesting, according to these sources, possible external backing, even though there are genuine local grievances, too.
Bandar Abbas in Iran is another location mentioned.
Right. Another critical port city for Iran energy exports, belt and road connectivity. It's reportedly suffered a string of suspicious explosions, fires, infrastructure sabotage.
Accidents or?
Well, Iranian officials have apparently voiced suspicions of Israeli involvement. Like Gwadar, Bandar Abbas is a key node. The West might want to destabilize to disrupt Eurasian trade routes and force China back towards sea lanes the U.S. Navy patrols. Also, Myanmar's Kyauktu port is mentioned as a similar target.
So the bigger picture strategy here, according to this analysis, is using proxies and sabotage to keep key nodes unstable.
That seems to be the argument. To prevent a truly integrated Eurasian economic bloc from emerging.
Keep Iran, Pakistan, China bogged down in local insurgencies.
Yeah, using low-intensity conflict, terror attacks, economic sabotage, diplomatic pressure, anything short of direct war to essentially bleed them slowly and hinder their integration and rise.
Okay, let's refocus on the Pahalgam attack itself. The analysis really frames it as a deliberate trigger.
Absolutely. A calculated provocation. Killing civilians, tourists. In a well-known spot, it's seen as designed to maximize outrage in India.
To force the Indian government's hand.
Exactly, to pressure them into a large-scale military response against Pakistan, which, given both are nuclear states, is incredibly dangerous.
And the potential fallout from a major India-Pakistan war. It goes way beyond just them, right?
Oh, massively. You could see missile strikes, air battles, troops crossing the border, full mobilization. The economic impact on the whole region would be catastrophic. Investment would dry up overnight.
And China gets pulled in how?
Well, China has billions invested in CPEC, much of it in Pakistan-administered territory. A major Indian offensive could threaten those interests directly, potentially forcing Beijing to intervene diplomatically or maybe even militarily.
Which could spiral into a wider regional war.
That's described as the potential nightmare scenario, or perhaps, from the perspective of those trying to derail Asia, a desired outcome, a way to tie down both India and China.
There's also mention of information warfare playing a role, like activating influencers in the diaspora.
Yes, the sources suggest that external networks, possibly linked to Western lobbying groups, might try to use social media and other channels to amplify anger, push for escalation, and polarize opinion inside India, making a measured response harder.
That adds another layer of complexity. So, given all this, what's the recommended path for India, according to these materials? How should it respond?
The strong advice is for a measured but firm response, not a knee-jerk, large-scale escalation. Retaliation is seen as necessary for deterrence.
We can't just do nothing.
Right, but it should be smart, asymmetric, and limited, focused on punishing the actual perpetrators and their support base without triggering that wider war.
What might that look like?
Things like targeted cross-border strikes on terror camps, cyber warfare against extremist networks, perhaps more economic sanctions, and a really strong diplomatic push to isolate Pakistan internationally.
So, hitting back, but carefully calibrating to avoid the escalation trap.
Precisely. The key takeaway is that India needs to avoid an emotional, large-scale military reaction. The analysis argues India's real strength, its path to becoming a major power, lies in strategic patience, building its economy, advancing technologically, not getting bogged down in costly wars.
So the suggested way forward is multi-pronged. Use all the tools.
Yes. All instruments of national power, economic leverage, cyber capabilities, intelligence assets, diplomatic pressure, and yes, limited precise military action. But avoiding that big conventional war is crucial.
Why the emphasis on avoiding conventional war, beyond the obvious risks?
Well, besides the immense human and economic cost, a major war could actually make India more reliant on Western military hardware and support, potentially undermining its strategic autonomy.
Interesting point. What about regional coordination?
That's recommended too. Quietly working with other regional partners, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, ASEAN nations who are also worried about instability in the Indo-Pacific.
And signaling to China.
Yeah, sending calibrated signals that India doesn't seek war, but will defend its interests forcefully if provoked. Recognizing that China's also in a tough spot here.
And underpinning all of this is
The push for self-reliance. Atmana Bharta, aggressively investing in domestic capabilities, defense manufacturing, semiconductors, energy security, critical infrastructure, reducing vulnerabilities.
So retaliation, yes, but smart retaliation. Strategic, not just vengeful.
Exactly. Focused on advancing India's long-term national interests, not just settling a score. That kind of strategic thinking is presented as absolutely vital in this modern great game.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it's pretty clear the analysis from our sources paints a picture of, well, a very complex and potentially dangerous geopolitical landscape. The Pahalgam attack isn't seen as just one terrible event.
No, it's potentially a move on a much larger chessboard. A part of this bigger struggle for global influence between rising Asia and the established Atlantic powers.
And the tactics described are really sophisticated and multi-layered.
Yeah, economic pressure, proxy forces, information campaigns. It's not just old-school military threats. It's about slowing down, fragmenting Asia's rise using a whole range of tools.
And a key vulnerability highlighted is Asia's own internal divisions.
Absolutely. The sources argue that external powers will inevitably try to exploit tensions. India, Pakistan, China, Japan, South China Sea disputes, North Korea. These are all potential levers to pull to create instability.
But the conclusion isn't totally bleak, right?
Yeah.
The future isn't set in stone.
No, it's not. The point is made that Asia does have agency. Its success really hinges on whether it can manage these internal differences, respond with strategic maturity, and build resilient economic and political structures.
And India specifically finds itself at a really crucial point.
A definite crossroads. The choices it makes now, pursuing calculated strength, focusing on economic growth, technological ambition will be critical. And China, too, faces big decisions about how it navigates these pressures.
So I guess the final thought for you, the listener, coming out of this deep dive is really profound. Can Asia rise above these deliberate destabilization efforts? Can it forge its own path? Or will it get sucked back into the cycles of a great game? Just a newer version, something to definitely think about.